Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics. We're still in the dark over whether or not the UUP will stay in the executive after rejecting the budget, but what we do know is that industrial action is already being organised as a result of the spending plans. In a moment we'll hear from a union leader on how the focus of that action has switched from Westminster to Stormont. Plus, with the voluntary and community sectors already fearful about their funding before the budget, what are their concerns now? It's been a busy week for politics and it'll be a busy week ahead. Joining me with his thoughts on all of that and more, the Northern Ireland editor of the Belfast Telegraph and the Sunday Independent, Sam McBride. After the high drama of the budget dividing the executive at the end of last week, the reality of what Stormont's stretched finances means for some workers on the front line is beginning to reveal itself. As things stand, there are now questions being asked about pay in health and education, a long-standing problem with pay and regrading for education support workers that everyone thought had been resolved now appears not to have been. Not surprisingly, the workers affected and their representatives are far from happy. With me now is the Deputy General Secretary of NIPSA, Patrick Mulholland. Welcome to the programme. Let's just start with education. Was it your understanding that education support workers would see previously made promises regarding pay and regrading delivered in last Thursday's budget?
Yeah, our understanding, Mark, was that we were reaching the completion of a project that had been going on for some time. An agreement was reached between the Education Authority and the trade unions last January. That agreement was in abeyance for a period of time because the Assembly was suspended. The Assembly returned. All the political parties indicated their support for the proposal that was on the table, and the expectation was that that proposal would be fully funded. That has not happened now, and it's moved us into new territory. What I can tell you is the last week was very difficult because our members are extremely upset by what has happened. A lot of them are in very difficult financial circumstances, and we are now at the point where we are going to reopen an industrial battle that takes us back to where we were before January the 18th. We have to get on with this and we have to make sure we win it now.
Is that the wisest strategy to employ at this stage, though? Because the Finance Minister said the allocations provided, she's accepted, do not include specific funding for the Education Authority pay and grading review. But she says she's committed to working along with Paul Given to find a resolution for what she calls these important workers. I mean, is that not reassurance enough that they, maybe if they're given the space, can try to resolve this sooner rather than later? And industrial action doesn't necessarily help that.
Well, I think you need to remember that this dispute was meant to be brought to a resolution 4 years ago. 2019 was supposed to be the point where it was resolved.
Yeah, but we are where we are now.
It is now tailed on for another 4 years. We now arrive at this point where, yet again, the promise that was made has not been fulfilled. At some point, these low-paid workers need to be the people who are made the priority, and this is the point. What we would say to the parties in the executive, we think Robin Swan has taken the right step in saying publicly he doesn't agree with the budget. We would call for all the parties to vote down a budget that does not meet the requirements of people in Northern Ireland, and instead vote through a budget that if it has to overspend, let it overspend. Let's meet the need of the people and let's stop kowtowing to the Tories. OK,
we'll come on to health in a bit more detail in just a moment or two. As far as industrial action, strike action is concerned in education, where does that stand at this point?
At this point in time, the trade unions are discussing with each other about what that industrial action will look like. But what we can say from NIPSA's point of view is we have prepared and are about to submit a renewed action short of strike action letter to the employers, and we will follow that up with strike action as well. And we're looking at quite extensive strike action right across the education system over the next 2 to 3 months. That's a real necessity now to drive home the point and make sure that this dispute is finally brought to a just settlement.
Well, that's exam time. Do you think that's going to be popular with teachers who've been working very hard with their students, with the students themselves, with their parents?
Well, I would imagine the Northern Ireland Assembly took all of this into account when they took the decision to put nothing on the table in front of education workers. I assume that they considered all the impact that it would have in education. And obviously, you're absolutely right, Mark. We are now at a point where we are heading into disastrous effects from this budget. And it begins to illustrate what the real problems are here. The budget cuts that we are now looking at affect real people. They affect their lives, they affect parents, and they affect children.
Let's move on to health then. It's a very difficult situation in education, obviously. The Health Minister Robin Swann is meeting the unions tomorrow. You'll be there, presumably. He's already said pay settlements for next year cannot be met under this budget. Very clear about that. What's going to happen at that meeting if Robin Swann and the unions are essentially on the same side?
Well, I think the first thing we have to say to Robin Swann is, as I have said earlier, Robin Swann needs now to give a commitment that he will work a proper budget. He'll work a needs-based budget that actually meets the needs of the health service, meets the needs of people in the community and meets the needs of health service workers. And he has to give that commitment, he has to be strong in that, and he has to hold the line on that going forward. The unions will support him in doing that. It's the right step to take, and it's the only way now that we can fund a health service. It's either that or people in the health service have to sit down with a list and decide who's going to die, who's going to suffer, who's not going to get proper service, what children are going to fall through the net, what old people are not going to be looked after. These are the choices now facing us. Either an overspend, which we would support as a good step forward, either an overspend or alternatively we implement real cuts that cause real suffering to ordinary people. Well,
there might be people watching this who would think it is nothing short of irresponsible for a health minister to deliberately commit to spending money he has not been given.
I think it would be the right step for any health minister to make, and I would hope that every one of the ministers in the executive would follow suit, because real irresponsibility is to decide that somebody must die, or to decide that a child falls through the net, or to decide that...
Well, that's very emotive. I mean, that's not the decision people would actively be taking. But, I mean, there is a responsibility on ministers to live within their means. There are rules and regulations for government departments and spending. You know that.
Well, let's be very honest about this and very clear about this. The rules and regulations around the finance of government are quite flexible rules and regulations. We have repeatedly, as a society, had a situation where there's been overspends in government departments, overspends by individual areas. These are necessary. They are, if you want to think they're a bad thing, they're a necessary evil, but they are something that now has to be applied. Okay. Alternatively, we arrive with a budget that is a disaster for Northern Ireland. Not only does it then have a real impact on people on the ground, but it undermines the very existence of the Northern Ireland Assembly, etc., and we can roll back into the place we were before.
Here's the challenge, just finally, for you, Shirley, and the union movement. You managed to get great support. You got everybody out to support the action you were taking. When the person holding the purse strings was Chris Heaton-Harris, when he was refusing to put the money into the health service that you said was necessary. So you got fulsome support for that. The problem is this time round, the people controlling the purse strings are the three most popular and the three biggest parties at Stormont: Sinn Féin, the DUP and Alliance. There's no guarantee you'd have the public support now that you had before.
Well, I think, first of all, the history of this is important. At the time of the discussions taking place between the political parties and Chris Heaton-Harris around the budget, my union, NIPSA, warned very publicly and very clearly that what was in the budget was not sufficient to fund Northern Ireland appropriately. We made those noises. We warned that this was coming down the tracks. We have now arrived at that point. Secondly, I think the political parties need to be clear. They have no mandate for this. There is no mandate for cuts. There's no mandate for them to introduce a budget into the Northern Ireland Assembly that will destroy public services. They need to stand their ground against the Tories. They need to stand with the people, and the people need to make sure and push them into that space. We need to have a budget that meets the needs of ordinary people.
OK. Interesting to hear your perspective. I'm sure those parties will all have their own views on precisely what their mandates are, and we'll hear from them, of course, in due course. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to join us now. Let's just hear from Sam McBride, who's been listening to all of that very carefully. The prospect then is for industrial action, potentially strike action, within education and health sooner rather than later. What do you think the public's view of that will be?
Well, I think that, first of all, it's not surprising that the trade unions, having seen the power that they had in forcing Stormont back, basically, I mean, I think that was the significant thing that got Stormont back, that they're not going to give up that power easily. They've seen what they can do. If they're unhappy about something, deeply unhappy as they are here, they've got that lever to pull, and they know they can pull it, and that will frighten the local parties. I think there is a massive problem here for the Stormont parties, because they have said that there hasn't been enough money sent to them by London. That's a perfectly reasonable argument to make. However, they have it within their means to raise more money here. Raise money from the wealthy, raise it from whoever they like. They can find all sorts of inventive ways to do that. And they have said there is nothing that they think people in Northern Ireland should pay extra. They've raised rates by the rate of inflation. So in real terms, nothing at all. That's not credible. It's perfectly credible to say we want to keep taxes low. That's what the Tories say. It's not credible to say keep taxes low and have massive public spending. And that's the central difficulty that Stormont has never resolved here.
What about a call from a senior union leader for ministers in an executive to deliberately spend beyond their budget?
Well, again, I think that is much easier to argue for now than it was 2 years ago. So what we had last year were senior civil servants authorising each other to spend beyond their means, because the budget that was set by London was derisory in terms of what was needed. I mean, it was really absurd. And so therefore, that has established a dangerous principle, I think, that there was a point where that was unthinkable. The idea that you would have billions of pounds committed beyond what you thought you would have at the end of the year, because you would literally run out of money and people would not be paid. Now we've got to a situation where that has happened. We've been bailed out by London. They have said, we'll write down these debts if you do certain things. And so that is not the unthinkable thing that it was once. That has happened. It's happened with the civil services approval, with London's approval, with the Treasury's tacit approval. So it's much easier to say that that is not a wild maverick thing to do now.
OK, it's a fascinating situation for sure. Sam, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk to you again a little later in the programme, but let's hear now from some of those who are really at the cold face of this budget. The community and voluntary sector has been walking a funding knife edge for some time. So how do people working in that area feel? We'll speak to Eileen Murphy from Women's Aid and Sarah Christie from Macmillan in just a moment. But first, here's a quick reminder of a series of contributions we featured earlier this year. We called it The State We're In, and it illustrates the kind of help so many people desperately need.
We have families also coming through who don't have electric in the home. They haven't had money to be able to buy the essentials such as food, heating and electric.
So we're finding that our young people in particular and families are struggling with deciding whether they can afford to put food on the table or make it to their appointment to have their treatment. We have a waiting list today that 10 years ago we would have been horrified at, to the extent that when we get a referral we are now prioritising on risk. And when I say risk, I'm talking about risk of significant harm or homicide.
We just can't service the demand. It's impossible for us to, as a charity, to service that demand because it is increasing month by month.
Our public health colleagues in social work, in mental health, in disability, in nursing are crippled trying to meet the demand for services. As waiting lists get higher and higher, people are still going into crises. And often it's charities that are at the cutting edge of providing that help. The concern recently and the frustration recently is that we have seen stagnant funding, which in real terms is equating to, a loss of funding year on year. And at that very time we're seeing demand for our services increase exponentially.
If they don't step up, the next thing we'll be recording are deaths from food poverty. That will be a sad indictment on all of us as a nation.
Eileen Murphy and Sarah Christie, welcome to Sunday Politics. Thanks for being with us today. Eileen, let me ask you first of all, have things improved since we spoke to you earlier this year?
No, definitely not.
They've got worse?
Yes, yeah. Funding has become really insecure. The pressure on us as an organisation to meet the demand just isn't, the pressure's huge and our ability to meet the demand just isn't there. And,
I mean, ironically, you were perhaps optimistic when Stormont came back that things might change for the better. Or were you not?
Not really.
You weren't even optimistic about that. I mean, and can you give examples of how things are getting worse at the moment and where you think things may get worse in the short term?
Yeah. Well, we're frontline grassroots service delivery, and we're very, low-hanging fruit. We're very easy to cut, and it'll be a one-day wonder, maybe headlines for 24 hours, and then it disappears. But the people that we deliver our services to, they're real people, and it's real pain and it's real suffering. We are very much part of the prevention of things getting worse, and in our line of work at Women's Aid, we are helping prevent homicide, and we're helping prevent significant trauma in children and young people. And you take the funding away, you've taken that, you've lost a vital and critical service to the
community. People sometimes forget that the decisions that are taken have consequences for real life people who are living in very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think if you're not directly impacted by the service, then, it's, oh dear, that's terrible to hear, but the next day you move on. Unless you're one of them people or that family that needs that service. And then the ongoing consequences is, dreadful, absolutely dire.
Sarah, you've been nodding throughout Eileen's comments. Are you concerned that things are bad and potentially about to get a lot worse?
I think with the announcement by the Minister of Health about the budget, he put on the table how much he needed to just stand still. That wasn't even achieved. So the worry now is we're going to go backwards. And as the community and voluntary sector, we're the first to be looked on to fill the gaps, no matter what department that is. But we're also the first that will be cut, no matter what. And it's a very poor situation to be in because, as Eileen said, behind all those statistics are actual people.
Yeah, and I wonder if you were particularly alarmed to hear the Minister suggest that it's possible that new drug treatments, which might be available elsewhere in the United Kingdom, might not be available in Northern Ireland. And you'd be specifically concerned, of course, about cancer drugs. Absolutely.
And it shows then an inequity across the UK if people aren't able to access things that others in England are able to get that treatment. That's a really sad state of affairs. And unfortunately, we've seen with cancer waiting times, ministerial targets are not being met. And people who are supposed to be waiting weeks are now waiting months. And the impact that that has, not only on your physical, but your mental health, is disastrous.
Yeah, well, it's very difficult for those individuals, but also for their families. And presumably that puts the services that you offer within Macmillan under extra pressure, because when you're getting to people, sometimes it's a more desperate situation they find themselves in and they need more resources. And what you have to offer is more stretched than ever before.
Absolutely. What we're finding is that people's cancer experiences are changing. We've got inflation, we've got cost of living crisis. In Macmillan, we offer grants. We've seen year on year in Northern Ireland the increase in demand for that. But we have to remember as well that inflation impacts what we deliver. So we're put between a rock and a hard place in terms of the cost of our delivery and the demand to meet that delivery.
Yeah, you also, of course, depend on donations and you would receive a lot of money from the public. But I suppose if the public is hard-pressed, then presumably those donations go down at the very time that you need them to be going up.
Absolutely. And when we're in a political landscape that we're in, you'll find that because the decisions that are having to be made ultimately impact the public, who are the ones that donate into our services. So you find yourself in a real vicious circle.
Yeah. Did you ever think, when you took this job on, that you would, within Macmillan, be using your resources to help cancer patients simply heat their homes?
Sadly, it's something that we've seen increase. And no, when I started in this role, obviously we want to make lives better for people living with cancer. We want to see better outcomes. We don't want to have to be paying people's heating bills because they're not looked after by the people we elect to look after them.
Yeah, again, Eileen, you've been nodding throughout Sarah's comments there. You work in completely different worlds, and yet your experiences are obviously very similar at the moment.
Very much so. People in need, people who are distressed for whatever reason, need help and support. We're working with traumatised people, traumatised children, traumatised young people. Every day of our lives we're working with that. Take the funding that, and the services, like I said earlier, totally outstrip our ability to meet the demand.
Yeah, I wonder what you think needs to happen now. I mean, we've heard from Patrick Mulholland there, who's a senior union figure, what he thinks needs to happen, and that's that politicians need to not worry about the terms of the finances that they are given by the finance minister. I don't want to draw you into a big political debate, but do you think there'd be public sympathy for that? I mean, what do you think the people you serve want the politicians to be doing?
I think they want them to actually do what's needed for the people on the ground. I think Patrick made a very effective comments. They're long-term thinking. It's no good thinking in short-term, when's the next election coming up. We need the politicians to do what's necessary for the people, however they do that. And it should be long-term, it should be prevention, because, the more we prevent things from escalating, then the less pressure there's going to be in the statutory services. And it's very, very short-term thinking to cut voluntary and community.
again, you're clearly agreeing, Sarah. What do you think the people you serve would like the politicians to be bearing in mind as they make very difficult decisions over the next weeks and months?
I think the problem that we have, we're in a general election year, possibly, and populist politics are not productive politics. So we're not seeing that collaboration. We know Sam's alluded to what needs to be done. We need to ask for more money, but we know that we could have a change in management in London, which means that might not be recurrent and coming down the line. So we need to be practical and look what we can actually achieve.
Yeah, I suppose to look at it another way, you may say that the politicians are popular politicians elected by the majority of people in Northern Ireland. I mean, the people who are supporting this budget are politicians from, as I've said, Sinn Féin, the DUP and the Alliance Party. So the people who potentially are protesting at the moment are the people who put those politicians in a position of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to the hard decisions, we haven't seen the record to deliver transformation because it's difficult. We've seen many, we've got a cancer strategy, we've got motions going through the Assembly about women's strategies, childcare strategies, but we can't deliver them without the funding. And that is our big stumbling block.
Yeah. If you had a very quick wish list, there might be some politicians up today watching this programme, taking on board a lot of what is being said. What message would you like them to take away, Eileen?
Think long term, think prevention, and talk to the people on the ground who are actually delivering them crucial services.
And if you had a takeaway for the politicians, what would it be, Sarah?
Be brave and look at the big picture.
Interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you both very much indeed for coming in to join us. Now, finally today, there have been a number of important stories around legacy in the last week or so. We'll talk to Sam in just a moment about that, but we wanted to bring you this from last week's Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. It's about apologies. When the Canova team published its interim report recently, it asked for apologies from both the UK government and the Republican leadership. The Chief Constable, John Boucher, led the team, which included the former Victims Commissioner, Judith Thompson. They were asked if, in their view, Michelle O'Neill's apology was an apology.
And both with regards to the Republican movement and the UK government, I would endorse what Judith said around how those apologies should be done. They should be done once, and they should be done properly, and they should be done with the support and involvement of those victims. And that's something I think we're yet to see. But I was pleased, very pleased, that the First Minister took the step to come out and speak publicly on the day.
It wouldn't meet the criteria for an apology as it would be accepted in any kind of international law or actually previous Northern Ireland practice, in that you have to be specific about who you're apologising to. You need to be specific about what you're apologising for. It has to be unequivocal. It has to include all aspects of the activity you're apologising for, and it needs to be delivered in a way which is agreed with and, in fact, led by the wishes, needs and rights of those who are harmed. So that's a process that hasn't started yet, really, in the kind of way it's envisaged in this report and the way it would be understood as an apology which, properly marks full recognition and responsibility for the harm done in all aspects. No, I don't think that what was given would constitute, an apology in those terms. But it is good that the word and the notion was present.
John Boucher and Judith Thompson. Sam, we just thought that in a busy week it was worth taking a moment or two to look at that short clip. And it's notable because there was a sense at the time of Canova's report being published, the interim report being published, that Michelle O'Neill had apologised.
Well, I think that this was basically misreported. I think as journalists, and I wasn't covering it myself personally, but as journalists, I think we have to take a bit of a hit here. Michelle O'Neill clearly did not apologise. I mean, I think that's simply a straightforward factual position. I'm not saying whether she should or she shouldn't or what language she should have used. The word she used did not apologise for what happened. What she said was she used the word sorry, and the word sorry has two meanings. One is to express regret about something, and one is to apologise. I'm sorry I can't run faster. I'm not apologising for it. But she was clearly saying that she was sorry for all deaths during the Troubles. Well, clearly Republicans weren't in any way responsible for all deaths during the Troubles. She couldn't possibly have been apologising for them. So I think that's very, very clear. What the former Victims Commissioner is saying there is that it has to move beyond that. Now, obviously, there is a flip side to this that the Boucher report said that the British government has to apologise as well. So it's not just one side here. But insofar as that was seen as an apology, I think that was a massive mistake.
Yeah, and to be absolutely clear, the UK government has said precisely nothing at all about that in terms of an apology.
Absolutely. And if you go back and you look at what David Cameron did with Bloody Sunday, that was an apology. Nobody was mistaken as to whether he was actually apologising. Of course he apologised. There were some people, some unionists, some hardline unionists who weren't happy about that, but they knew what he was doing. And I think if this is a proper apology, we'll not be debating whether it's actually an apology. We will know.
Yeah, John Boucher's been in the news quite a bit over the past week because he made some other comments that are interesting in the context of a whole blur of stories that took place, inquests called for by the Attorney General. That window closes, we know, this Tuesday night under the legacy legislation. We had a coroner prevented by the Secretary of State from delivering his view on loyalist murders in 1992, more on Kingsmills and the murder of Sean Brown. So the question that John Boucher addressed was, who's controlling the information about what happened here and for what purpose? And interestingly, the man who's now the Chief Constable of the PSNI talked to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee about the perception of there being a cover-up in some quarters.
So if you look at what John Boucher is saying here, I think it's difficult to present him as some sort of deep securocrat from, you know, the deep state or whatever, the way that some people would have viewed former chief constables. And I'm not criticising chief constables, saying that's how they were viewed by some people. He is clearly much more open. He has clearly dug into this very deeply, albeit his report, his first part of his Op-Canova report has not been as detailed as some people wanted, but he clearly has seen that material himself. He's been very affected by it. But I think that he is, to an extent here, still riding two horses, as he is on lots of things. There's an element of him that seems to be pleasing lots, or trying to please lots of different people. He's saying there wasn't widespread collusion, is a sort of general frame for this, but he's also saying some of this stuff is really horrific. At some point in individual cases, he's going to have to pick one or the other. Do we release this, or do we try to keep it under wraps?
OK, just a very quick word about the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference tomorrow and the issue of migrants coming from the UK into Ireland, just quickly.
Well, it's a massive embarrassment, if you like, for the Irish government that they have pushed so hard during the Brexit talks to have an open border. No, that's not helping them. OK, more about that tomorrow. Sam, thanks very much indeed. That's it for now. If you missed any of the programme, you can catch up on the iPlayer, of course. I'll be back on Thursday with The View at the usual time of 10:40 on BBC One. For now, from all of us, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.